The laugh started with Patterson. It was the kind of laugh that does not arrive all at once, the kind that begins as a sound in the throat, and then, when it finds agreement in the room, expands into something fuller, something that feels collective even though the original impulse belonged to one person. Patterson had the gift for these moments, had cultivated it across years of working in environments where the ability to control a room's social temperature was its own form of currency, and he deployed it now with the casual efficiency of someone who has learned exactly how little effort is required to turn a room against a person who does not look like they belong. I had said something. Not something wrong. Something accurate and specific and grounded in a depth of understanding that the room did not yet know I possessed. But the specificity had apparently struck Patterson as evidence of exactly what he had been waiting to confirm about me, which was that I was out of my depth in this particular briefing, in this particular room, among these particular people. He had looked at the two men beside him, the quick side glance of someone establishing shared understanding, and then he had laughed. "Where did you say you were from?" he said. "Somewhere in Ohio?" "Pennsylvania," I said. "Right," he said. "Pennsylvania." He said it the way certain people in certain buildings say the names of places that are not Washington, with the particular inflection that communicates. This explains everything. This is why you are here, and not quite here simultaneously. This is the category you belong to, and the category is not the one this room requires. A few people laughed. Not everyone. Perhaps 6 or 7 of the 14 people in the room. But 6 or 7 is enough, in the specific social mathematics of a briefing room, to constitute a consensus that has been established, a verdict that has been quietly rendered. I think, Patterson continued, enjoying himself now, enjoying the specific performance of someone who believes he is revealing a truth the room needed to understand, that maybe some of the nuance here is going to be a bit beyond. He stopped. He stopped because the door had opened. And what came through the door changed the quality of the room so completely and so immediately that the laugh died in the space between one breath and the next, and what replaced it was the particular silence of people realizing, all at once, that they have been performing for an audience they had not anticipated. I should tell you who I was in that briefing room, because Patterson's assessment of me, though wrong in every particular that mattered, was not entirely without foundation in the visible evidence available to him. My name is Ellen Marsh. I was 36 years old on the morning of the briefing. I had grown up in a small city in western Pennsylvania, the daughter of a woman who managed the front office of a regional insurance company and a man who had worked in natural gas extraction for 28 years before his back gave out, and he had transitioned into a series of jobs that paid less and required more management of the specific kind of dignified stoicism that working-class men of a certain generation developed and never quite put down. I had been, by every external measure of the small city I came from, an unlikely candidate for the room I was sitting in. The school I had attended was not one of the schools that sent graduates to the kind of institutions that produced the other people in that briefing room. My family had not possessed the particular connections or the specific resources that would have suggested, to someone looking at my background before they had ever spoken to me, that I was destined for anything that required the kind of clearance the Pentagon building required just to enter. I had joined the Navy at 19. Not because I had a plan exactly, but because I had understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has examined her available options carefully and found most of them inadequate, that the Navy offered a path towards something that the small city in western Pennsylvania could not provide, which was a context in which the specific way my mind worked was a qualification rather than an anomaly. The specific way my mind worked was something that teachers had noticed across my education, sometimes with enthusiasm and sometimes with a kind of unease that came from not having adequate categories for what they were observing. I was not simply good at analysis. I was good at a particular kind of analysis that combined pattern recognition with an unusual tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to hold multiple competing hypotheses simultaneously without the premature closure that most people, even intelligent people, are drawn toward when uncertainty becomes uncomfortable. This had made me, as a child, difficult to place. My teachers had not quite known what to do with me. My parents had loved me completely and understood me imperfectly. My friends had mostly liked me while finding me, in certain moments, slightly strange in ways they could not articulate. The Navy had known exactly what to do with me. I had moved through the institution's analytical functions with a kind of ease that I recognized, in retrospect, as the specific ease of someone who has finally found the context for which they were designed. The work made sense to me. The requirements made sense to me. The specific combination of rigor and creativity that the best intelligence analysis requires was exactly the combination that my particular mind was built for, and the institution had recognized this, and had directed my development accordingly. By the time I was 36 years old, sitting in a briefing room in the Pentagon on a Tuesday morning in November, I had spent 17 years building a career in signals intelligence and analytical operations that had reached a level of significance I am genuinely not able to characterize fully in this account, not because I am being modest, but because characterizing it fully would require describing things I am not permitted to describe. What I can tell you is that the specific role I held at the time of the briefing was not the kind of role that was visible in the Pentagon's ordinary institutional hierarchy. It was the kind of role that existed at a level where visibility itself was a liability, where the value of what I did depended in part on the fact that very few people, even within the building I worked in, knew precisely what it was. Colonel Patterson, however, did not know any of this. What Patterson knew was that I had grown up in Pennsylvania, that I had arrived in the briefing room without the particular social markers that his world used to assess significance, and that when I had offered a specific analytical observation, I had done so without the particular performance of confidence that his world recognized as the appropriate packaging for serious contributions. He had made an assessment. The assessment was wrong. The door opening was the beginning of the demonstration of exactly how wrong. Admiral James Crawford was 60 years old, and he had been in the Navy for 38 of them. He was the kind of man whose presence in a room altered the room's functioning before he had spoken a word, which was the product not of height or bearing or any of the physical things people sometimes attribute to the presence of authority, but of something deeper and less easily articulated. The specific gravity of someone who has made decisions across decades in conditions where the decisions were real and the consequences were real, and who carries that history in a way that room's full of. People are somehow capable of sensing without being told. I had worked with Admiral Crawford in the specific and limited sense that people at my level of the institution work with people at his level for approximately 3 years. The working relationship had developed through the particular channels that such relationships develop when two people are operating on different sides of the same critical function, channels that are indirect and carefully structured, and that nevertheless produce, over time, a genuine professional understanding between the parties. He had never been in this particular briefing room before, as far as I knew. His attendance at this morning's briefing had not been announced in advance, had not been on the schedule I had received, and his presence, as he stepped through the door, was apparently as unexpected to most of the other people in the room as it was to me. I registered his arrival with the particular interior stillness that I had developed across 17 years of working in environments where unexpected arrivals sometimes required rapid recalibration of everything that was happening, and I recalibrated, without visible disruption to my external composure, in approximately 2 seconds. Patterson had not finished his sentence. He had stopped mid-word, which was perhaps the most revealing possible moment for the interruption to arrive. The laugh still incomplete, the cruelty still in progress, suspended now in the specific kind of freeze that occurs when a person realizes they have been observed doing something they would not have chosen to do in the presence of the person who has just arrived. Admiral Crawford stepped into the room. His aide closed the door behind them. 2 other people followed, people I recognized from their institutional roles, as belonging to a level of the building's hierarchy that was not routinely present at the kind of briefing this had been described to be when the invitations went out. The room's 14 occupants had rearranged their postures in the collective way of people responding to a change in atmospheric pressure. Not quite standing, not sitting exactly as before, somewhere in the particular middle state of people who are uncertain whether the protocol of the moment requires them to do more than acknowledge the change without making it more dramatic than necessary. Crawford surveyed the room. His eyes moved across the faces of the people present with the particular economy of someone who has learned to read rooms quickly and who does not waste the motion. He acknowledged, with a slight nod of someone confirming information rather than performing recognition, several of the faces he encountered. Then his eyes reached the far end of the table. They reached me, and something happened in his expression that was, by any external measure, extremely small, a slight adjustment in the set of his jaw, a particular quality in his gaze shifting from the scanning attention with which he had moved across the rest of the room to something more focused, more specific. He said, "Kingfisher." I want to describe the room in the moment after that word because the moment is the center of the story, and it deserves the most careful description I can give it. Kingfisher was not a name anyone in that room had heard before, with the exception of two people, one of whom was me, and one of whom was the Admiral who had just said it. It was not a name that should have been spoken in a room with 14 occupants of mixed clearance levels, in a briefing that had been organized under a classification that did not encompass the program the name was connected to. It was the kind of name that existed in a compartment considerably above the level of the work that was supposed to be happening that morning, a name that signified a function and a role, and a set of operational activities that were, even by the standards of a building full of classified information, unusually protected. The Admiral had said it. In this room.
To me.
The silence that followed was not the brief silence of a room processing new information. It was the longer, more complex silence of a room understanding that something had just happened that it did not possess the framework to interpret, that a reference had been made to something that existed outside the universe of things the room knew about, and that the reference had been directed at the woman whom, approximately 90 seconds earlier, one of the room's more senior occupants had been in the process of dismissing as someone whose small-town origins placed certain things beyond her reach. Patterson was very still. He was sitting 3 seats to my left, and I did not look at him, and I want to be honest about why I did not look at him, which is not that I was savoring his discomfort, though I would be dishonest if I said his discomfort was entirely outside my awareness. I did not look at him, because looking at him would have suggested that what had just happened was about him, and it was not about him. It was about the Admiral.
About what the Admiral had said.
About what the Admiral saying it meant in the specific context of this room, and this morning, and the 17 years that had produced the work the name represented. I looked at Admiral Crawford. "Sir," I said. He crossed the room to the end of the table where I was seated, and extended his hand. "Commander Marsh," he said, using my rank rather than the code name now, the specific professional courtesy of someone returning a conversation from the register it had briefly occupied to the register appropriate for the current setting. "I didn't know you'd be in this briefing. I was asked to provide analytical support for the operational assessment," I said. "Of course you were," he said, in a tone that suggested this was both unsurprising and entirely appropriate. He looked around the room, briefly, his gaze touching the other faces with the particular quality of someone noting what he had found in a room that had not been arranged for his benefit and that he was now, gently and without drama, rearranging in his mind. Then he pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. "I need to tell you, as carefully as the constraints I operate under will allow, something about what Kingfisher was and why Admiral Crawford's use of the name in that room was so significant. Kingfisher was not a person. It was a program designation, one of the names used within a specific classified compartment to identify a set of analytical and operational activities that had been running for approximately 4 years at the time of the briefing. The activities involved a type of signals intelligence work that I am not going to characterize more specifically here, but that had produced, across those 4 years, outcomes that were significant enough to be briefed at the highest levels of the naval command structure and significant enough to have attracted, periodically, the attention of officials at levels above even that. The connection between me and Kingfisher was not something I had disclosed in ordinary institutional settings. Within the specific clearance compartment where the program existed, my role was known to the people who needed to know it. Outside that compartment, I was simply Commander Ellen Marsh, Analytical Officer, background in signals intelligence, origin Western Pennsylvania, rank appropriate to her years of service, presence in this briefing room explained by the routine needs of the current operational assessment. The Admiral had known me as Kingfisher for 3 years. He had received across those 3 years briefings on the program's activities and outputs that had led him, over time, to develop the particular professional regard that comes from repeatedly encountering work that exceeds expectations in conditions where exceeding expectations is genuinely difficult. Why he had said the name in that room, given that the room's classification did not accommodate it, was something I did not fully understand in the moment he said it. I would understand it later. He would explain it to me, with the directness of someone who had made a deliberate decision and was willing to account for it. For now, in the room, I simply received the moment and managed it. This assessment is going to take an unexpected turn, Admiral Crawford said to the room, in a tone of pleasant conversational authority, as though what had just occurred were entirely routine, because I need Commander Marsh's input on several matters that exceed the current scope of the briefing. I'm going to need most of you to step out for approximately 30 minutes while I address those matters with her and a few of the people I've brought with me. It was delivered so calmly, with such complete absence of drama or explanation, that it took a moment for the room to absorb what was being asked. Then people began to stand. Patterson stood. He did not look at me as he moved toward the door. He moved with the particular careful blankness of someone who is processing something significant and has decided that processing it visibly would be worse than processing it not at all. The others filed out in the particular way of people who have just been removed from a conversation they had believed they were central to and who are doing their best to exit with dignity. The door closed. I will not tell you the specifics of the 30-minute conversation that followed, because I am not able to do so, and because the specifics are not the point of this story. The point is what happened before and after, and what those things mean. Admiral Crawford spoke to me about several operational matters connected to the program. His team provided updates I needed. I provided analysis they needed. The conversation was professional and specific and entirely contained within the compartment where it belonged. Near the end of the 30 minutes, after the operational matters had been addressed, Crawford leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at me with a particular expression of someone who has something to say that is slightly outside the procedural frame of the meeting. "I know I broke protocol," he said, using the program name in this setting. "You did," I said. "I'm going to tell you why." I waited. "I was standing outside the door for approximately 2 minutes before I entered," he said. "Long enough to hear what Patterson was saying. I absorbed this. I want to be clear that this was not what I would have chosen as the method," he said. "If I had known you were in this room when I arrived, I would have handled it differently. But having heard what I heard, and having understood what was happening in that room, I made a judgment that the most direct correction available to me was the correct one." "You used the name as a corrective," I said. "I used the name," he said, "because the name is the most precise possible communication of what this room did not understand about the person it was in the process of dismissing. There was not a more efficient way to accomplish that communication." I thought about this carefully. "There are going to be questions," I said, "about what the name means, about what it was connected to. People at the classification level in this room will not be able to answer those questions through normal channels," Crawford said. "They'll ask. They won't find answers. And that absence of available answers will communicate, in its own way, something important about the scope of what they didn't know. You plan the effect of the not knowing," I said. "I used what was available," he said. "The same way you use what's available in your analytical work." There was something in his voice when he said this, a quality of genuine professional recognition, the specific warmth of someone who has respected someone else's work for years and is allowing that respect to be, briefly, visible. "Thank you," I said. "For the record, I had the situation under control before you arrived." Crawford smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that belongs to someone who does not smile easily, and whose smiles therefore mean something specific. "I know you did," he said. That was never in question. The other 14 people were allowed back into the room 30 minutes after they had been asked to leave. They entered with the particular quality of people who have spent 30 minutes in a hallway conducting the kind of conversation that groups of professionals conduct when something unexpected has occurred that they are trying to understand, the low-voiced conference of people comparing limited information in hopes of assembling a more complete picture. They had not assembled a more complete picture. There was no more complete picture available to them through the channels they had access to. They filed back in and found their seats, and the briefing resumed, and for approximately 90 minutes the scheduled work of the morning proceeded with the particular professionalism of people who have agreed, without explicitly agreeing, that the previous hour will not be directly addressed while the current hour's work is happening. Patterson did not make additional remarks about Pennsylvania or small towns or the nuance of whatever he had been about to say when the door opened. He contributed to the briefing with the careful competence of someone who is managing the specific task of behaving normally under conditions that are not normal. I contributed with the same clarity and specificity that had, in its original delivery before the interruption, prompted the laugh that started this whole thing. Nobody laughed this time. After the briefing, the room cleared quickly. The particular efficiency of people for whom the scheduled morning had contained more than they had anticipated and who were processing the excess on their way to whatever came next. Patterson was the last to leave, which I noted without looking at him directly. Near the door, he stopped. He said my name. My actual name, not Commander Marsh, not any rank-appropriate form of address. Just my name, the way people use someone's name when they have run out of the formal structures they usually rely on. I looked at him. I don't know exactly what happened in here this morning, he said. I don't know what Kingfisher means or what your connection to it is. I'm not going to be able to find out through any of my usual channels, based on the fact that nobody I've contacted in the last half hour has been willing to tell me anything about it. He paused. But I know enough to understand that I made an error in judgment. And I'm telling you that directly, because I think you deserve directness more than you deserve a careful avoidance of the subject. I looked at him for a moment. Thank you, I said. For what it's worth, he said, the analytical point you made before I interrupted you is correct. I knew it was correct when you said it. The interruption was not about the analysis. I know, I said. He nodded once. Then he left. I sat in the now empty briefing room for a few minutes, not particularly because I needed to, but because the specific texture of the morning deserved a few minutes of quiet reflection before I moved into the rest of the day. I called my mother that evening from my apartment in Alexandria, the particular habit of Tuesday evenings that I had maintained across several years of living in the DC area, the scheduled call that was not really scheduled, but that had become, through repetition, a kind of reliable anchor in a week that otherwise had no reliable anchors. She answered on the second ring, as she always did. We talked for the usual amount of time about the usual things, how my father's back was managing, what the weather had been in western Pennsylvania, a thing she had read in the local paper that she thought might interest me. The ordinary texture of a phone call between a mother and a daughter who love each other and who have learned, across years of distance and limited ability to share the actual substance of the daughter's working life, to be nourishing within the limits of what is available. At some point in the call, she said, as she sometimes said, "Are you doing okay? At work, it's hard to know from here." I thought about the briefing room, about Patterson's laugh, about Crawford at the door, about the 30 minutes and the conversation and the specific quality of professional respect that had been communicated in the small smile that did not come easily. "Yes," I said. "I'm doing well." "You sound okay," she said, with the particular accuracy of a mother who has been listening to the specific quality of her daughter's voice for 36 years and has developed, through that listening, a calibration that no instrument could replicate. "Something happened today," I said. "A good something. I can't tell you the specifics." "You never can," she said, without particular complaint, the simple acknowledgement of a fact she had absorbed years ago and had made peace with. "But good is good. I'll take good." "Good is good," I agreed. She asked about the weekend, about plans, about whether I was eating regularly in the way that mothers ask about such things regardless of the age of the person they are asking. I answered all of it with a patient warmth I had for these calls, these ordinary moments that existed at the complete opposite pole from the extraordinary moments of the working day and that were, in their ordinariness, as necessary to me as anything the work itself required. After I hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of the apartment, the particular quiet of a Tuesday evening in November, when the day has contained more than most days contain, and the quiet feels genuinely earned rather than simply the absence of noise. I thought about Patterson, not with anger, though I would not have claimed complete absence of anger either, anger being a reasonable response to having been publicly mocked in a room full of peers. But with something more complicated than anger, the particular complexity that comes from understanding both the harm done and the human weakness that produced it. Patterson was not a bad man, by any accounting I had available to me. He was a man who had built his career in a specific environment that rewarded specific markers of significance, and who had learned, through years of operating in that environment, to use those markers as reliable proxies for actual value. He had encountered someone who did not carry the expected markers, had made an assessment based on the absence of those markers, and had been wrong in a way that had been made unexpectedly and publicly visible. The wrongness was real. The harm was real, but the mechanism that had produced both was not the mechanism of cruelty. It was the mechanism of a limited framework being applied with too much confidence to a situation the framework was not adequate for. I had seen this mechanism operate throughout my career, in the specific way that environments like mine are prone to producing it. The tendency to evaluate significance through visible credentials, through the particular markers of background and education and social ease that announce themselves in the opening minutes of a professional encounter, and to miss, entirely, the significance that exists in people who do not carry those markers and who are therefore, by the framework's logic, not expected to carry significance of the kind the room is interested in. Crawford had disrupted that framework with a single word. Not because he had been trying to make a point about Patterson specifically, though the point had been made, but because the word was the most direct available communication of a truth that the room needed and did not yet have. I had been grateful for the disruption, and I was honest with myself about the gratitude, because the disruption had provided something I had not been in a position to provide for myself in that setting, a correction of the room's mistaken understanding that did not require me to make the case for my own significance, which was both professionally inappropriate given what I was not permitted to discuss, and personally distasteful given the way that making such cases tends to look from the outside. The name had done it. A single word, carrying the weight of 4 years of work and the specific regard of a man who had observed that work from a distance and formed a genuine assessment of its value, had done in 1 second what I could not have done in an hour of carefully managed presentation. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Crawford approximately 3 weeks after the briefing, in a context considerably more appropriate than a room full of people without the right clearance. I had been called to a meeting that was, by its nature, one of the more regular kinds of interaction between people at my level of the institution and people at his, the specific kind of professional touchpoint that exists to ensure that the people responsible for the operational function and the people responsible for its oversight have adequate communication between them. At the end of the meeting, after the official matters had been addressed, Crawford said something I had not expected. "I want to come back to what happened in the briefing 3 weeks ago," he said. "All right," I said. "I want to ask you something directly. When Patterson said what he said, before I entered the room, how close were you to responding?" I thought about this honestly. "Not close," I said. "Why?" "Because responding would have required either disclosing things I'm not permitted to disclose or making an argument for my own significance that would have looked exactly like defensiveness regardless of how I framed it. Neither of those was the right move." "So, you were going to let it stand," he said. "I was going to let the work speak when the work could speak," I said. "Which it does, eventually, in the channels where it's allowed to speak." The briefing room on that particular morning was not one of those channels. Crawford looked at me with the steady attention that I had come to recognize across 3 years of indirect professional contact as his default mode of engaging with things he found genuinely interesting. "That's a kind of patience," he said, "that most people find very difficult." "It's practical," I said. "Patience in situations where acting prematurely would make things worse is just good operational sense. And in situations where it also happens to require tolerating something genuinely unfair," he said. I held his gaze. "Also practical," I said. "Being demonstrably right is considerably more effective than being demonstrably angry. Anger gives people something to respond to other than the substance of what you're actually saying. Patience makes the substance unavoidable." He was quiet for a moment. "I have recommended you," he said, "to a process that I am not going to describe in detail here, but that will result in a conversation you should expect to receive within the next several weeks. I'm telling you this now so that you understand the recommendation exists and was made on the basis of 3 years of observing exactly the quality you just described." I absorbed this. "The name in the briefing room," I said. "Was that connected to this recommendation?" "No," he said. "The recommendation was already in motion. The briefing room was a separate decision, made in the moment on the basis of what I heard from outside the door." He paused. "I want to be honest about something. Using the name in that setting was irregular. I would not typically make that choice. I made it because what I heard from the hallway was specific and the correction I could provide was immediate and proportionate, and I judged that the value of the correction outweighed the irregularity." "I'm glad you made that judgment," I said. "I know," he said. "You were very composed about it in the room." It was not a difficult thing to be composed about, I said. When someone else is doing the correcting, composure is considerably easier than when you're doing it yourself.
The small smile again, the one that did not come easily.
Yes, he said. I imagine it is. The weeks after the briefing produced, in the particular way of professional environments that are smaller than they appear, a gradual, quiet redistribution of how I was understood by the people who shared my building and my work. Patterson did not make additional comments about Pennsylvania or small towns, or the accessibility of nuance to people from places outside the expected geography of professional significance. He was, in the weeks that followed, professionally correct, which was both more and less than what had preceded the briefing. Several other people made contact in ways that were, without exception, professional in their framing, but that contained within their professionalism a quality of genuine interest that had not been present before, the particular interest of people who have learned that someone they had not fully registered is, in fact, worth registering. I received this with the composure I had brought to everything else. I want to tell you something about that composure because I think it is the least understood part of what this story is actually about. The composure was not a performance. It was not a mask worn over a different, more reactive interior. It was, to the extent that these things can be genuinely cultivated rather than simply inhabited, a real characteristic built across 17 years of work that had required it so consistently and so completely that the building and the characteristic had become, at some point that I could not identify precisely, the same thing. Composure, in the work I did, was not the absence of feeling. It was the specific discipline of not allowing feeling to determine action in moments when allowing feeling to determine action would produce inferior outcomes. The anger at Patterson's laugh was real. The satisfaction at Crawford's correction was real. But neither of them had been allowed to direct my behavior in the briefing room, because in the briefing room the only relevant question was what the right action was, and right action was independent of how I felt about the provocations that the morning had provided. This was a thing I had built. Not a thing I had been born with. The 17-year-old girl from western Pennsylvania, who had understood from an early age that her mind worked differently than the frameworks around her were designed to accommodate, had not possessed this composure. She had possessed the raw materials for it, the specific tolerance for ambiguity, the pattern recognition, the genuine comfort with the uncertainty that composure requires, but the composure itself had been built, year by year, across the accumulating experience of working in environments where the alternative to composure was something worse. I thought about this on the evening after my conversation with Crawford, sitting in the same apartment where I had sat on the evening of the briefing, the Alexandria quiet around me, the November dark outside the window. I thought about Patterson's laugh, and about the specific pain of it, which was not the pain of a wound too large to manage, but the pain of something precise and familiar, the recognition of a pattern I had encountered before, in rooms that preceded this one, in forms that varied but that shared the same essential structure. Someone deciding, on insufficient evidence and with excessive confidence, that I was not what the room required and communicating this decision in ways that enlisted the room's agreement. I had managed this pattern across 17 years, with the composure I have described. I had allowed the work to speak when the work could speak, and I had not, in the interim, made a case for my own significance that required the listener to take my word for it. But I want to be honest about what that management had cost. Not in professional terms, not in terms of outcome, because the outcomes had been, by any fair accounting, significantly better than they would have been if I had managed differently. The cost was more personal than that. The specific accumulation across 17 years of absorbing, in room after room, the particular weight of being evaluated by a framework that I had no adequate way to correct without violating the constraints that made the work itself possible. Crawford's word in the briefing room had not erased those years or resolved the framework's inadequacy. It had done something smaller and more specific. It had provided, in one precise and unexpected moment, a correction that the morning situation called for, delivered by someone who possessed the standing and the information to deliver it effectively. It was not the correction of a lifetime of rooms. It was the correction of one room on one morning by one person who happened to be outside the door at the right moment. But rooms add up. Corrections add up. And the accumulation of moments when the truth of what someone has built finds a way to become visible, even briefly, even imperfectly, even through the irregular use of a code name in a setting where code names are not supposed to appear, is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. If you have ever sat in a room where someone decided, with excessive confidence and insufficient information, exactly what you were capable of and what you were not, I hope you hear this. The room's assessment was always working from an incomplete file, and somewhere in the hallway outside the rooms that have consistently underestimated you, there are people who have seen the complete file and who are waiting for the right moment to say what needs to be said. Sometimes they say it quietly. Sometimes they say it with a single word that no one in the room expected to hear. But they say it eventually. And when they do, the silence that follows is the particular silence of a room understanding, all at once, that what it thought it knew was not the whole story. The whole story was always larger. The whole story is always larger. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If something in this story reached you in a place that needed reaching, I would love to know where you are watching from and what part of it stayed with you longest. Stay with us. There are more stories to tell. I want to go back and tell you more about the years that preceded that briefing room, because the composure I brought to that morning was not something that arrived without cost, and the cost deserves to be named honestly rather than smoothed over in service of a cleaner narrative. Western Pennsylvania, in the years I grew up there, was a place that had once been organized around things that had since departed. The steel industry that had given the region its identity and its economy had been in long decline before I was born, and the specific culture that the steel industry had produced, the close-knit neighborhoods, and the particular masculine identity of the mill towns, and the very specific understanding of what hard work looked like and what it produced, had persisted long after the economic conditions that gave rise to it had changed. My father's back had given out when I was 13. The job he had held before it gave out had been physically demanding in ways that the body does not accommodate indefinitely, and the jobs available to him after were not jobs that the particular masculine identity of the region had prepared him to inhabit easily. He managed it. He managed it with the specific stoicism I mentioned, the particular brand of dignity that men of his generation and his community had developed for exactly this kind of situation. But the managing had its costs, and some of those costs were visible to a 13-year-old with pattern recognition sufficient to see them clearly. My mother had been, across all of this, the functional spine of the household. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way that gets described in certain kinds of stories about certain kinds of families, where the mother's role is performed for an audience and therefore requires dramatic moments to make visible. In the ordinary, daily, undramatic way of someone who understands what needs to be done and does it without commentary. She had not gone to college. She had not had the opportunity, had not had the framework for understanding that it was an opportunity she might pursue, had come of age in a time and a place where the available templates for a woman of her background did not prominently feature college. She was intelligent, genuinely and significantly, in ways that the life available to her had never given adequate room to express. She managed people and situations with a precision that I recognized when I was old enough to have context for it, as a form of analytical intelligence operating in the only domain where it had been given permission to operate. I had understood, watching her across the years of my childhood, something that I would not have been able to articulate at the time, but that became increasingly clear as I grew older, that the gap between what someone was capable of and what the available world allowed them to do with that capability was often enormous, and that the enormousness of the gap was not visible to the people on the side of the gap where things were working out because those people had never had occasion to look across it. This understanding had shaped, in ways I could not have predicted at 13, the specific orientation I brought to the work I eventually found. I had always understood, with the direct knowledge of someone who had watched it operating at close range, that the frameworks used to evaluate significance were not the same as significance itself. That the markers used to assess potential were not potential itself. That the gap between the two was real and large, and that the people on the side of the gap, where things were not working out, deserved something more than a polite acknowledgement of their limitations. When Patterson had laughed, the laugh had landed on 17 years of understanding that laugh. Not the specific laugh, not Patterson's laugh specifically, but the mechanism behind it, the particular confident assumption that the available markers were sufficient to determine the full picture, that Pennsylvania was a fact about what I was capable of rather than a fact about where I had started. I had managed it with composure. But composure is not the absence of knowing what is happening. It is the discipline of not allowing what you know to determine what you do, in situations where what you know would produce a response less effective than the one composure allows. The process Crawford had mentioned, the one he had said would result in a conversation I should expect within several weeks, arrived approximately 5 weeks after our conversation. I am not going to describe the specifics of what was discussed or what was offered or what I decided, because those specifics belong to a category of information I am genuinely not able to share in this context. What I can tell you is that the conversation was significant and that the significance confirmed something I had understood about my own career for several years without having had it confirmed externally in quite this form. What I can also tell you is that when I called my mother the following Tuesday evening and she asked, in her calibrated way, how work was going, I said, "Very well." And I meant it with more specificity than I usually meant it when I said it. "Something happened," she said. Not a question. The observation of someone whose instrument for reading me had been refined over 36 years. "Yes," I said. "A good something. A significant one. Are you able to tell me anything about it?" "Not the specifics," I said. "But I can tell you that something I've been building for 17 years was recognized recently by the people who are in a position to recognize it properly." She was quiet for a moment. "That's good," she said. "Simple. Genuine. You've worked very hard." "I have," I said. "Your father," she said, "would be proud if he understood what you do. He doesn't understand the details. But he's proud of who you are in ways that he doesn't always have words for." I thought about Patterson and the laugh and the way that inadequate words sometimes produce inadequate actions. "I know," I said. "The words are hard sometimes. That doesn't mean the feeling isn't real." "No," my mother agreed. "The feeling is real. She paused, and I could hear her searching for the precision. "He just doesn't have the vocabulary for something that has no equivalent in his experience." The vocabulary problem again. The framework problem. The specific difficulty of understanding across a gap that has no available bridge. "I know," I said. "I've come to peace with that." "Have you really?" she said, with the gentle challenge of someone who has been listening to me long enough to know the difference between the piece I perform and the piece I actually have. I thought about it honestly. "Mostly," I said. "I've come to peace with it for him. It's still a work in progress for other people." She laughed, the real laugh, the one that had been there across my entire life and that remained, regardless of what intervened, the most reliable sound of home I possessed. "That sounds honest," she said. "I'm trying to be honest," I said. We talked for the usual time about the usual things, and when I hung up the apartment was quiet in the particular way of quiet that feels genuinely restful rather than merely the absence of noise. I sat for a while. I thought about the briefing room and the laugh and the door opening and the silence that had followed a single word. I thought about 17 years of work that had existed in rooms where its significance was known and in rooms where it was not, and about the specific experience of moving between those two kinds of rooms, of being the same person in both, and of understanding, in both, exactly what was and was not available to be communicated. I thought about my mother at 20, in a time and place where the templates available to her had not included the option I had eventually found, and about what she might have built if the templates had been different, if the framework had been wider, if the gap had been smaller. I thought about composure, about what it cost, about what it produced, about the specific relationship between the cost and the production, and about whether the exchange was worth what it required. And I thought, sitting in the quiet, that it was. That 17 years of building something real in the specific obscurity that the work required, of managing the rooms that did not see it, and of trusting that the rooms that did see it were sufficient, had produced something that was more solid and more genuinely mine than anything a more visible kind of career could have produced. Because visibility has its own costs. Because the work that is performed for an audience is shaped by the audience in ways that work performed for its own sake is not. Because the composure I had built across 17 years, and the specific quality of the work that composure had allowed me to do, had developed in the particular freedom of not needing to make a case for myself to rooms that were not equipped to understand it. Patterson's laugh had been a cost. The years of rooms that did not see the full picture had been costs. But the freedom of working without an audience, The specific liberty of being able to do the thing as well as it could possibly be done without adjusting it for the comfort of people who needed it simpler or more visible was worth more than I could calculate. Crawford's word in the briefing room had not been the point. It had been a correction, welcome and appropriate, and delivered with a specific directness that I had valued in the man across 3 years of professional proximity. But it was not the point. The point was the 17 years. The point was always the work. If you have spent years building something real in spaces where its significance could not be announced or displayed or properly understood by the people immediately around you, I want you to hold on to something I have come to believe with complete conviction across 17 years of exactly that kind of building. The work does not require an audience to be real. The significance does not require acknowledgement to exist. The composure you have built to carry it is not a performance of someone who does not feel the cost. It is the real thing. It is the thing you have actually built. And it is more solid, more genuinely yours, more completely and irreducibly what it is, than anything that required an audience to take shape. Patterson's laugh was a Tuesday morning. 17 years was the whole story. The whole story was always the one that mattered. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I hope it found you where it needed to find you. Stay with us. There are more stories to tell.